So let's talk about Snowpiercer Season 2, and in particular the character of Mr. Wilford. Now, I recently finished watching Snowpiercer Season 2, and while it wasn't horrible by any means, the show is very frustrating to me because it has all the things necessary to make a really good show. It has a good premise, it has good production values, good sets, it has a very good cast. All the actors they have are, generally speaking, do really good jobs. The problem is the writing is bad, and the writing was passable at least for the first half of season one, but in season two the writing is kind of really terrible if you kind of really look into it. The problem is that the performance of the actors kind of obscures how bad the writing is, if that makes sense. And that's something you really had in Game of Thrones in the later seasons, is the actors just did a really good job with the really bad circumstances they had. Like if you watch any of the Dragon Demands videos, he goes into detail about how the writers had no idea what they were doing. They didn't explain the motivations to any of the characters. I know Steve Delane, after Stannis died, said, I have no idea why my character did any of this. And as an actor, if you're trying to act the way the character would, you have to understand what their motivations are. You have to understand like what the hell's even going on. Like we have no real explanation for why Danny goes crazy in the second to last episode. Amelia Clark just tried to do what she could given really bad instructions. And as much as good things can be said about the last few seasons of Game of Thrones, a lot of it is just carried on the charisma and ability of the actors rather than the actual quality of the show. Like if you were to take the scripts or whatever and look at them without the particular actors reading them, they would be really, really bad. But because you're used to this cast and they really don't phone it in, they're professionals about it, that kind of covers it up. And that's really kind of the issue with season two of Snowpiercer. Is the dominating figure of season two is Mr. Wilford. We've kind of told Andre Layton's story, we've told Melanie Cavill's story. It's kind of time for Mr. Wilford to come from the background as this kind of godlike mythological figure to the forefront and to be the dominant personality. And the issue is he is terribly written. The writing for this character is awful. The thematic background for this character is awful. But this is covered up by the fact that he's played by Sean Bean. Now, Sean Bean's a good actor. Sean Bean, you can say a lot of things about him, but I never feel like he's phoning a performance in. And this is a role that really, I think, plays to his strength. It's a scenery chewing, campy, roguish, charming, megalomaniacal villain. And Sean Bean really hits it out of the park. But like I said, that kind of covers up how badly written the character is and how bad the writing for this season is. So I don't know if you really want to say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess it's good because it makes the show more watchable. But when I look at it and I think of what a job Sean Bean could have done if they had have given him like a non-crappy script to work with, then it just kind of frustrates me. Okay, so let's talk about Snowpiercer Season 2, and let's get into what my issue with Mr. Wilford is. So this show's a little complicated, so it's going to be kind of hard to explain this to people who haven't seen Season 1. But basically, Snowpiercer was built by was built by Melanie with funding from Mr. Wilford, initially to be a luxury train, but eventually Melanie repurposed it into an ark to save humanity. And Mr. Wilford wanted to use the train as his personal pleasure palace to spend the last days of humanity in a state of complete degeneracy, hedonism, and moral decadence. And he didn't have any real ideology or plans for the future. And this perception of him is kind of contrasted with the way everybody else in the show sees Mr. Wilford as this almost godlike figure. And part of this is because Melanie's built him up that way. But everyone else seems to have an immense amount of respect for him. And to see him, like I said, it's almost this godlike messianic figure. And when he shows up at the end of season one in the second train, Big Alice, his crew basically worships him as a god. They all are completely 100% devoted to him. They'll all die for him. They will do basically whatever it is he tells them to do. He's shown as this extremely charismatic, almost satanic like figure. And the problem is, there's no on screen reason for that. You can say Mr. Wilford's a really charismatic, charming figure, but that's just because Sean Bean's a charismatic, charming actor. When it comes down to it, like there's no depth to Mr. Wilford. They try really hard to make it seem like there's depth to him. Like they have his relationship with Melanie's daughter, and they have the way that people perceive him as this messianic figure. And you have some vague references to he's going to bring about order and he has this big plan. But ultimately, he's a character that has no ideology, no vision for the future, nothing to him despite being a sleazeball, despite being a really sleazy, hedonistic asshole. And that just doesn't make for an interesting villain. Or it's not even really that, because there's nothing wrong with really having someone who's just a piece of shit being a villain. There's nothing wrong with having someone who's affably evil, who's kind of nihilistic, that sort of thing. But he doesn't fit within the mold that the show's trying to give him. Like in season 1, Melanie was nominally the villain, I guess you could say. But she was a very complicated character. Her moral compass was, at the end of the day, not that different from Andre Layton and a lot of the other protagonists in the show. She was just in an extremely bad, almost impossible situation, and she was kind of having to try to make the best of it. She was trying to save humanity and make the decisions that no one wanted to make. So even if she was nominally the villain, she was immensely sympathetic and complicated, and you kind of went back and forth between whether you thought that the ends justified the means or not. I kind of, something I liked about Snowpiercer season 1 is that there wasn't really a clear good guy and a bad guy, at least until the end of the season when the oligarchs tried to take power. In season 2, they try to do a similar thing with Mr. Wilford. They try to make it, I think they're trying to make it ambiguous to the audience. Maybe things would be better if Mr. Wilford took over again. Because when he shows up, a large portion of the passengers were like, we want Mr. Wilford back. He's going to do something that we're never going to specify, and things are going to get better somehow. And there's never really any context to this. Mr. Wilford doesn't have a vision. He doesn't have an ideology. There's nothing to him despite him just being kind of a sleazy, hedonistic asshole. He doesn't try to espouse some vision about how we're going to build a new utopia. He doesn't try to do some sort of, I'm the aristocrat who's going to use noblesse oblige to lead you. He doesn't do some sort of populist thing. He doesn't do anything. He just kind of shows up and he's like, I'm Mr. Wilford. I am played by Sean Bean. You want me to lead you because I'm Sean Bean and I am a good actor. And that's really all there is to him, and it's very frustrating. Because I think even if you wanted him to be evil, even if you wanted him to be the villain, there needed to be just a little bit of moral ambiguity there. Just a little bit of complexity that he was trying to present an actual alternative for Layden and Melanie and for what the other people were trying to do with the remnants of humanity. Because in season 1, you had kind of a contrast between the technocracy that Melanie wanted to implement, which in many cases was cold and didn't really involve much input from the crew and the people involved, but largely functioned and kept people fed and kept the, pun intended, the train running on time, with kind of the more idealistic democratic ideas of Andre Layden and Third Class and the unjustness of Snowpiercer's class system. But when Mr. Wilford comes in, he doesn't have any of that. And they make it even worse because Melanie figures out early on in season 2 that the Earth is starting to warm up, that there's certain parts of the world that'll be warm enough in the near future that they can start recolonizing it. And Mr. Wilford's approach to it is to try to cover it up and to try to prevent anyone from finding out that the Earth is warming. Why? I don't really know. There's not really an answer given. I think it's because he just wants to control Snowpiercer and rule it. Why does he want to do that? I don't know, because he's just the designate bad guy. And I think what all this comes down to is this is something I noticed when I read the first of the new Thrawn novels that takes place in the Star Wars reboot, is the people that they're aiming this at are such pussies, are so easily triggered, they can't even depict things anymore. They can't depict things even in a villainous context. So they can't depict racism even if it's in a villainous context. They can't depict sexism even if it's in a villainous context. So they just have to make vague allusions to things, or they have to, ironically enough, whitewash the villains. So, like in the new Thrawn novel, they get rid of human supremacism pretty much entirely, and it's explained as there's bias against aliens because aliens disproportionately sided with the CIS and the Clone Wars. It's like, so they can't even show galactic racism anymore because the people who read it are so easily triggered. They can't do it even for the purposes of making them look villainous. Likewise, the Empire is now not like patriarchal anymore. You have like some black female Grand Admiral. You have, they just insert a whole bunch of random female officers because they can't show patriarchy even to make the Empire evil. So the Empire is now not racist and not patriarchal, but they're still the designate bad guys. And that's kind of the thing with Mr. Wilford. So like they try to add some like really weird ideological dimensions a couple of times. Like Alex is like, when I went over at Snowpiercer, I saw powerful women, and that's not something I saw on this train. It's like, when did Wilford ever express any kind of patriarchal ideas? I don't really remember when that even happened. I mean, the dude is just like a psychopath with no political ideology. He just wants to control things. He doesn't have noblesse oblige. He doesn't view himself as an aristocrat of the soul. He's just a tyrant. And then Andre tries to make it about race. He's like, you're just a rich white male. Like the same people created this crisis. And that's also like objectively not true, because a lot of first class were like Asians and black people and homosexuals, and they were like diverse too. So they try to make it like Mr. Wilford is this racist white patriarchal male through very vague implications, but they can't show any of that on screen because the people who are going to watch this are such pussies that if they showed that on screen, then they would get upset and they wouldn't watch the show. So, like, they just have to make him a designate villain, and they just make him do really crazy shit, like getting people to cut their wrists open. He's supposed to be like this really intelligent, legitimate threat to the heroes, but none of his plans really make any sense. Most of them, in my view, are really stupid. I don't even really get how he succeeds in taking over. People just kind of side with him because that's where the plot needed to be towards the end of the episode. But he's a horrible villain. And the only reason he carries the show is because Sean Bean plays him. And there's nothing complex to him. He's not like, he's just the designate villain, and they have him do villainous stuff to try to make you care about it. And it's like I said, you can see why people follow him as a charismatic figure because Sean Bean's charismatic, not because anything about the writing provides any context to any of it. So season 2 of this show is just kind of a complete mess, and it's sad because it's such a missed opportunity. They could have made him into this interesting, flawed, but somewhat sympathetic figure, but instead he's just a psychopath. And that doesn't make for a very complicated villain. And if they wanted to make him just a mustache-twirling villain, there's nothing wrong with that. But they portrayed it as if, like, he's not, like, he doesn't try to fool people. Like, if he was a psychopath who put forward a persona that he did care about people and that he did love people and that he was a populist or man of the people or something. But they just don't. It's just awful. So that's my thoughts on Mr. Wilford and I guess on Snowpiercer season 2. Who knows what season 3 will bring? I'll probably watch it, but it's just kind of a disappointment at this point.